I work as a nurse in a post-surgical unit in the biggest hospital in my city. Patients come from hundreds of miles away to get their operations here. The surgeons are known to be the best. But what we don't tell the patients, what we're not supposed to tell them, is that there are ghosts here. Just like any other hospital, people pass away and their spirits sometimes linger, or maybe it is just a fragment of them that remains behind, something that science can't explain yet. There have been more than a few events that have raised the hair on the back of my neck, and some have sent me into hysterical screaming fits. But those types of reactions are frowned upon in the hospital. So I try to stay calm. There was that time a few months ago when a patient told me she felt like there were 3 other people in the ward room with her in each of the other 3 beds around her. They were talking back and forth and whispering, she said. But the weird thing was, she was alone in the 4-bed room. I pulled back the curtains and showed her myself. All of the other beds were empty, and there were no visitors or staff in the room with her. As if that weren't disturbing enough, a few weeks later, a different patient said the exact same thing when she had been left alone in the same room. She described it exactly the same way, saying they were whispering back and forth, and it was keeping her awake. I felt a chill up my spine when she told me that, but reassured her that the room was empty, and she was simply imagining things. People have enough to worry about when they're recovering from surgery. We don't need them fretting about specters and ghosts when they should be worried about physio and discharge appointments, lifting restrictions, and medication adjustments. So we keep these stories to ourselves. Some nurses said they couldn't sleep in a certain storage room during breaks on night shift since they'd had too many bad experiences there. When I asked them about it, they said they'd had bad dreams and felt like someone was in the room with them, standing over them while they slept. I didn't believe in those things myself, so I slept in there on the night shift and found out firsthand why nobody else wanted to use it as a nap room during breaks. I had the most realistic waking dream I'd ever had, where I'd awoken in the storage room and felt like someone was in there with me, watching me from the corner of the room, their dark outline visible in the dim room. When I went to turn on the lights, they didn't work, and the door wouldn't open, and for some reason in my dream, which seemed like reality, I chose to lie back down and go to sleep again, while the thing crept closer and closer, vanishing only to reappear just above me. It felt like my eyes were open the whole time, and I was forced to watch, paralyzed, as it got hovered over top of me. For what felt like hours, it was watching me while I slept, as I struggled and was unable to move. I finally came to my senses and finished my break early, going back to work and trying to forget about the horrible experience. But I refused to sleep in that storage room again. There was another event which haunts me to this day, especially since I'm heading in for a night shift right now, in just a few minutes. Another nurse told me a story on the night shift last week, and I've been thinking about it a lot since then, and it's been occupying my mind more and more, especially when I'm alone in the break room at night. We have a staff room where there are 2 small couches and a TV. Some nurses go in there to sleep during breaks on the night shift, and we try our best not to wake them up. She was sleeping on the couch there one night, and a bright light woke her up. There's an adjoining room with a bathroom and lockers, so she figured one of the nurses had gone in there and left the light on. I looked over at the door, she told me. You know how it has that little glass window and you can see through to the other side? Yeah, I said. I see it every day. So, there's this woman on the other side of the door, and she's looking at me through the glass. I got shivers up my spine when she said this. Maybe because it was the night shift. Maybe because that was where I was going on my break, in an hour to sleep, or at least try to. And so I see her there, but she's not really looking at me. She's just kind of staring straight ahead. And the first thing I notice about her is her hair. It was in this very old-fashioned sort of style, not like anything you'd see today. It was like it was from the 70s or earlier, maybe. And she was wearing these funky blue pinstripe scrubs. And a nurse's cap. You know, nobody wears a cap anymore these days. And those scrubs, they looked like the ones, you know, in the lobby, how they have those ones on display. From way back when. Yeah, they looked just like that. I was nodding along, able to picture all of it, as if I was there with her. Another nurse walked in and heard us. What are you guys talking about? Ghosts, I replied simply. He scoffed. You guys believe in that stuff? The 2 of us shared a knowing look. He hadn't been working on the floor long enough to have seen them himself. And some people just aren't attuned to these things. The nurse went back to her story. So she's just standing there, staring straight ahead, and I thought it was the IV nurse at first. Because sometimes they'd come in during the night shift and use the bathroom or whatever. So I yelled at her, "Hey, turn that light off, will ya? I'm trying to sleep in here." but she just kept staring straight ahead. So I just put the pillow over my head and tried to sleep some more. Then when I woke up later on, and that light was still on. So I asked around. Nobody came in there during the night. And that room is locked. So it wasn't a patient. And I saw the IV nurse later on, and they were not dressed like that. So yeah, I'm pretty sure I know who it was, though. According to her, the woman was the ghost of a nurse who had died driving home after a long night shift and had fallen asleep at the wheel. Based on the description she'd given, an older coworker had recognized her. She'd said that was exactly what an old nurse who used to work there looked like. And from that point on, the nurse who told me this story always remembered to stay awake behind the wheel on the drive home. Every time my eyes start to blink and I'm getting tired, man, I think about that old nurse with the curly gray hair standing behind the glass, and I'm wide awake again. Better than a frickin' cup of coffee, I'll tell you. Something occurred to me as she finished the story. That's really weird. My patient in room 14 told me last night that they saw someone peeking their head in the room and looking at them. And sometimes they would stand in the doorway and just stare at them for a while. She said the person had a very old-fashioned haircut and old-fashioned scrubs. She thought it was a ghost or maybe a hallucination. Ghosts and hallucinations are commonplace on the post-surgical floor, and sometimes it can be difficult to tell the two apart. Pain medication-induced post-operative delirium is not unheard of, especially in the elderly. She thought it was the Dilaudid. So none of that tonight, just sticking with Tylenol. Good idea, the other nurse said, and I excused myself. I figured I'd check on my patients, especially the ones in room 14. I was somewhat unsurprised to see a woman in blue pinstripe scrubs with a cap looking in at them from the doorway. Despite my terror, I began to walk on shaky legs down the hall towards her. She turned to look at me and went away from the patient's room, going down the side hall at the end of the unit. I ran to catch up with her, needing to see for myself who she was. When I got to the end of the hall, I looked to the left. She was gone, but it had only been a few seconds. I ran down the short length of hallway to the next corridor. This other one was much, much longer. She could not have disappeared so quickly unless she went into a patient room. But again, she was gone. My heart hammering in my chest, I refused to believe it was a ghost. Such things didn't exist. They just couldn't. Room 9 was the only one she could have gone into in such a hurry. I went in and found all of the patients were wide awake, despite the late hour of the night. It was 3 a.m., and everyone should have been asleep. "It's freezing in here. Can you get me a warm blanket?" asked the patient by the door. I told her I would, and she nearly screamed in fright. "Oh my goodness," the old woman said, startled. "I didn't see you there." "So who are you talking to?" I asked. "The other nurse, the one who just came in. Where did she go?" I felt a presence behind me and looked to see the shape of something moving, but then it was gone, like a wisp of smoke on a windy day. Not wanting to tell the woman it had been a ghost, I just made up an excuse and told the woman I'd get her a warm blanket. Nothing seemed to help, though. None of the patients in that room slept very well that night. If at all, they kept saying they felt like there was something laying in the bed right next to them. Come to think of it, it's the same room where patients kept imagining other people were in the room with them, except this time it really was full. I haven't seen the ghost nurse since that night, and I'm hoping I never do again. It's terrifying to say the least, since I don't really understand why she's here. And you never know exactly when she's going to show up. I'm heading into work for another night shift now. Wish me luck. I'm gonna need it. I worked in intensive care for 12 years, and I saw some strange things. One night we had 4 patients in a row lose very important lines. No one was in the room with them. Our desks were designed so that we had a desk between 2 patient rooms. We could see both rooms from one desk. The patients were sedated, on the vent. The first had a central line that pulled out. We managed that, stabilized the patient, and then the next patient pulled out their breathing tube. The next a feeding tube. The next another breathing tube. There was no reason we could figure out for this. Some patients would see a little boy in red pajamas come to their door or into their rooms. The patient would die soon afterwards. I only had one patient that saw him. She had a stroke. We were doing comfort care only. I was working night shift. Throughout the night, she had periods of being afraid, so I would hold her hand and we would talk, the best she could, and this would calm her down. During one such talk, she said, "Watch out for Bruce. Bruce is my dad's name." This woman didn't know me, did not know my dad, and I had made no mention of him while taking care of her. I said, "Who is Bruce?" Thinking maybe it was someone close to her. She laughed and said, "You know who he is. You look just like him." I had chills all over. I do look like my dad, just like him. She said, watch out for him. Make sure he doesn't fall. And then she drifted off to sleep. A little while after that, she saw the little boy dressed in red. She asked who he was, why we had children in the unit. I told her we didn't. It was an adult ICU. I asked her to describe him. She said, I guess he's about 2 or so. Blonde, wearing red pajamas. He comes to the door and just stares at me. He doesn't come inside. She died later that day on day shift. We had superstitions about certain things, such as, if a patient was dying, tie a knot in the bed sheet and the patient would last through your shift. Or, if a patient was dying and it seemed to be unusually prolonged, open the doors or windows and give their spirits somewhere to go. Sometimes patients would hold on until a certain loved one arrived at the hospital to say their goodbyes. Some patients would hold on until a date had passed so that they wouldn't die on an anniversary or birthday or other important date. Occasionally, we'd have a room where several patients in a row would die. So we started asking the chaplain to cleanse the room after 3 deaths. That would almost always end the cycle. The worst thing I saw was with a very mean old woman. She was in our unit for a couple of days. She was awful. She would say mean things to the staff. She cursed at everyone. She didn't have any family or friends that came to visit her. One night she had a cardiac arrest and we put her on the vent. She was awake on the vent and she was terrified. She was looking up, not seeing anything in this world, and she was shaking her head, no, very emphatically. She was holding her arms up as if to protect herself. She looked like she was trying to scream, but of course, she couldn't make any sound because of the breathing tube. We tried to calm her down, to sedate her, but nothing worked. She had another cardiac arrest and died. After her death, we contacted her sons. It was then we learned why no one visited. She had abused her 2 sons their entire lives. Both had cut off contact with her. Whether you believe in hell or not, she was going somewhere she didn't want to go. My wife, girlfriend at the time, in the 1990s, worked at a hospital that was built in the 1800s and had been converted into a palliative care hospital at some point. There were modern wings added and another section with low-care units, a bit like single-level cabins in a garden setting, for those who were still independent enough to take care of themselves, but needed to be close to medical assistance. Some of the original old building remained in use, and it had numerous areas where cold drafts, stubborn doors, and other issues existed. The best one was a door that would lock and then be completely unlocked seconds later with nobody around to turn the lock. Anyway, my wife got a ride to and from work with a neighbor who also worked there, but on Fridays that lady would finish up at lunch. So that my wife could still work a full day, I would go and pick her up, about a 40-minute drive each way. Because the traffic was unpredictable, I always gave myself an hour to get there. I would wait outside the brick cottage used as an office on an old church pew. Some of the older residents from the low-care units would wander around the grounds. It was a beautiful rural setting. After a few weeks, I came to know Ken. He was in his 80s and lived in low care. He had some ongoing issues and would spend days at a time in the hospital, then be back home for a few weeks. He worked out my routine, and each Friday he'd be sitting on that church pew waiting for me. I enjoyed talking to him. He was full of life experience and had done so much in his younger years. He loved sharing those stories, and I enjoyed listening to them. Ken had a 1980s Toyota Celica. He couldn't drive it anymore, but he didn't want to sell it. When family came to see him, he'd make them drive him around in it. He would always ask me to take him out for a drive, but I barely knew the man and didn't want to drive an unfamiliar car. Besides, I only had 20 minutes or so before I'd be on my way. Ken was an avid golf player. He told me how his son came to visit him once a week, confirmed by my wife, and they'd go out in the Celica. I assumed they were going to golf. Ken would recount how well he did. He'd tell me about plowing a ball into the rough or scoring 3 birdies in a row. He'd also keep count of the balls that went in the water. Each week was a different story. Some weeks he would be 3 over once his handicap was taken up. Other times he played really well and was 1 under after handicap. I wasn't into golf myself. My dad and brother played all the time, so I was familiar with it. His stories were always different and so well told. Once the week's golf game highlights were covered, he'd tell me about his time as a young man in the Air Force and WW2 stories. He stayed in the Air Force for many years as a mechanic, becoming a team leader and training instructor for new mechanics. Eventually, he became a trade teacher at a technical college and did that for 10 or so years before retiring. He had stories about machining new parts out of whatever they could to make things work, failures, funny workshop incidents, and then funny student stories from the college period. A whole lot of entertainment for me. I found myself leaving earlier and earlier on a Friday so I could spend more time with him. Occasionally I'd turn up and he wouldn't be there, but then my wife would tell me he's in the hospital for a stint. I actually found myself missing our little chats. About 9 months of this, and things changed. This particular Friday seemed like we were back to normal. He wasn't in the hospital anymore, and back on the church pew. He recounted the week's golf game. I desperately had to visit the restroom, so I excused myself to go. When I came back, he was gone. I told my wife, and she said, "Oh, sorry, I forgot to tell you. Ken passed away earlier this week." But I was just there talking to him before I went to the toilet. He told me about the golf game. How could that be? Are you sure it's the same Ken? The following week, I noticed his car had moved from the usual spot under the carport of his unit to the visitors' parking area. In its place was a large four-wheel with a big trailer on the back, partially loaded with furniture and boxes. It made me stop. It seemed like a confirmation he was gone, but I was still hoping he was alive and well. After all, I'd been talking to him a week earlier. I walked down to the unit and found his son cleaning out the contents. I introduced myself. He knew about me. Ken had told him about our Friday chats. He confirmed his dad had passed the prior Tuesday. I didn't want to upset him, so I kept quiet about how I'd spoken to him the week before, 3 days after he died. But I now had confirmation that it wasn't the human body of Ken sitting on that church pew talking to me. He went on to say that his dad loved an audience and hoped he didn't bore me. Quite the opposite, actually. We spoke for a bit about some of the funny war stories and Air Force tales, and I told him how impressed I was that Ken was still so sharp and could recount each week's golf game. He had a puzzled look. Golf game? Yes, he would recount in great detail each week's game. He then told me Ken hadn't played golf for at least 10 years. I was stunned. His son then explained he used to pick up Ken each Thursday, go to the cemetery to visit Ken's wife's grave, then on to a cafe for lunch, before doing some grocery shopping, topping up the car with fuel, and returning home. A good 4 or 5 hours all up. About how long I would expect him to take for a round of golf. He never once mentioned any of those activities. It amazes me that he could recount so much detail. The golf stories had to be past experiences, as the play-by-play detail he gave just couldn't be made up.